We're going to dive right into our keynote address. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and our plenary speaker, Dr. Ronny Desmet, a now retired, congratulations, Belgian researcher, member of the editorial advisory board of the Whitehead Research Project, and prior to his retirement, a math teacher at Xavier's College in Antwerp, affiliated with the Center of Logic and Philosophy of Science at the Free Universities in Brussels. Ronny is an expert, a leading expert in Whitehead's life and work, with a particular focus on mathematics and physics, but not exclusively so. So we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us, and please come on up.
Good morning. Almost day to day, 100 years ago, on September 25th, 1924, Whitehead gave his first lecture as a professional philosopher in this hall, Emerson Hall at Harvard University, and I thank the organizers for the honor of lecturing on Whitehead's Harvard legacy at this commemorative conference. In his first Harvard lecture, Whitehead emphasized the truth that all things are interconnected, and that reality is a process that brings about the fluent togetherness of things. It was the germ of what would become a vast philosophical oeuvre. Also, nearly 100 years ago, on February 9th, 1925, John Cobb was born, and John's intellectual career made him Whitehead's most prominent heir. He epitomizes the current relevance of Whitehead's process philosophy in a wide variety of contexts: process theology, religious pluralism and interfaith dialogue, sustainable economics and fair monetary system, general non-profit education, non-reductionist biology and evolutionary theory, and last but not least, ecological civilization. You can imagine how difficult it was for me to choose for this occasion just one or two concepts from Whitehead's vast oeuvre and to hint at their relevance in a new context. Finally, I chose to highlight two related concepts: recognition and prehension. On the latter concept, John Cobb wrote, "Prehension may be the single most important and original concept in Whitehead's philosophy." Moreover, recognition and prehension turn out to be relevant in the context of the much-discussed claim that artificial intelligence will equal or surpass human intelligence. According to Whitehead, speculative philosophers imaginatively generalize from particular topics and test the success of their imaginative experiment by the applicability of its results beyond the restricted locus from which they originated. Whitehead's speculative concepts of recognition and prehension are major illustrations. The concept of recognition originated in Whitehead's experience as a mathematician. The concept of prehension originated in his interpretation of electrodynamics. Both concepts were imaginatively generalized by Whitehead in Process and Reality and can be applied beyond mathematics and physics, for example, when comparing artificial with human intelligence. 1. The origin of the concepts of recognition and of prehension. In Science and the Modern World, Whitehead wrote that he arrived at his convictions by reason of his own studies in mathematics and physics. I first look at Whitehead's take on mathematics and then turn my attention to his interpretation of electrodynamics. According to Whitehead, mathematics is the study of patterns. As a mathematician, Whitehead knew from first-hand experience that intuitive pattern recognition is the core of mathematical practice. As the co-author of Principia Mathematica, he also knew that mathematical theories can be formalized by means of the logic of relations. However, contrary to Bertrand Russell, Whitehead did not take Principia Mathematica as a reduction of mathematics to logic. He was convinced that intuitive pattern recognition is the bread and butter of the mathematician. Without it, the logical enterprise heads for bankruptcy. I will now turn to Whitehead's interpretation of electrodynamics. According to Whitehead, electrodynamics is all about events characterized by electric charges, and he defined an electron as a historical route of events characterized by a single electric charge. But he immediately warned not to identify an electron with its historical route, because this identification leads to the simple-minded theory that an object is in one place at any definite time and in no sense anywhere else. Whereas, in a sense, as Faraday already remarked, an electric charge is everywhere. Hence, Whitehead completed his definition of an electron by including the systematic way in which it modifies all events. I'm sorry, but like Whitehead in his Harvard lectures, I do need to explain a bit more in detail this systematic event modification. To better understand what follows, keep in mind that Whitehead stated that this can be illustrated by a familiar fact of life. The waves as they roll onto the Cornish coast tell of a gale in mid-Atlantic. The gale in mid-Atlantic may have passed, but due to the waves, it still influences, flows into the Cornish coast. Now think of a single electric charge event in an electron's historical route as the gale in mid-Atlantic, and of any event in its future as the Cornish coast. Each electric event transmits a wave potential. This wave potential does not propagate at infinite speed and cannot instantaneously modify other events. The wave potential spreads in all directions at the finite speed of light and can only modify events lying in the future of the electric charge event that transmitted it. The wonder of electrodynamics is that the event modification, that is the causal influence of a single electric charge event on an event in its future, can be calculated by means of the wave potential arriving in that future event. And the assemblage of the causal influences of an electric charge event on all events in its future is called its electromagnetic field of force. Looking at it the other way around, we can say that the overall electromagnetic field of force in any event is due to all electric charge events in its past. Clearly, past electric charge events are not over and done with. They causally influence all events in their future because their wave potentials flow into these future events. And looking at it the other way around, any event appropriates all electric charge events in its past by appropriating and unifying their wave potentials. Translated in the language of process and reality, as an electric charge event perishes, it gains objective immortality. It superjects itself into its causal future by means of its wave potential. And looking at it the other way around, any event prehends all electric charge events in its causal past by prehending and unifying their wave potentials. This implies that any event can be seen as a process of prehensive unification of potentials of past events. Now you might think that I am cheating. I promise to show that Whitehead imaginatively generalized from physics to philosophy, and it seems that I am merely applying his philosophical language to electrodynamics. So let me prove that Whitehead's prehension terminology does predate his 1929 book Process and Reality, and that he did use it to formulate his interpretation of electrodynamics. In his early Harvard lectures on October 9 and December 18, 1924, Whitehead introduced the electrodynamic theory of wave potentials to his students. And on February 10, 1925, Winthrop Bell noted down that Whitehead said that the physicist in his theory of electrons, considers how electrons interfere with one another's life history in the field of force, and that this involves the prehension of all electrons, that they are prehended together in the field of force. Whitehead added that the fundamental fact is a prehensive unit, that is, an event looked on as a grasping together of a number of limited aspects of the totality. 2. The imaginative generalization of the concepts of recognition and prehension. Let's first look at Whitehead's gradual generalization of the mathematician's pattern recognition. In London, after his mathematical career at Cambridge, Whitehead claimed that recognition was not only the source of mathematical knowledge, but of natural knowledge as well. The recognition of objects in sense perception was pivotal to the notion of cognition in his natural philosophy. In 1919, in an inquiry concerning the principles of natural knowledge, he wrote that recognition is the source of all our natural knowledge. And in 1920, in the concept of nature, he emphasized that recognition is not primarily an intellectual act, but a non-intellectual relation of the mind to nature, which provides the material for the intellectual activity. Finally, in 1929, in Process and Reality, he made the speculative claim that human intelligence is the fruit of prehensive unification. Our intellectual feelings, if they emerge in the higher phases of processes of prehensive unification. So what about recognition? Well, the mathematician's intuitive judgment of patterns and the natural scientist's conscious perception of objects are the best illustrations of Process and Reality's intellectual feelings. And they are feelings of recognition. Moreover, unconscious recognitions determine the processes giving rise to these conscious recognitions. Let's now look at Whitehead's speculative generalization of the electrodynamic notion of prehension. Winthrop Bell's notes of Whitehead's Harvard lecture of February 10, 1925 include not only Whitehead's assertion that the concept of prehension is a key concept of electrodynamics, but also Whitehead's early imaginative generalization of this concept. That is, the generalization from the electromagnetic field of force in any event due to the prehensive unification of all wave potentials of all electric charge events in its past to the psychological field in any mental event of a human being, emergent from the prehensive unification of all potentials of all events in its past, but especially the bodily events. Indeed, Whitehead noted down that Whitehead said the following: the physicist's field of force and the psychological field both give you the same apprehension of field. Here and now, I am experiencing myself as one among others, but as apprehending aspects of everything else. I am a process of unifying the totality of things, not simply, but in patterns of modal aspects. That grasping of aspects is the very nature of what my body comes to as a whole. In this respect, I'm very different from the idealist. Instead of cognition being the fundamental fact, it seems to me the most variable thing about the process of unifying. This process is a grasping together of aspects in which there may or may not be cognition involved. It is impossible to highlight each step in the gradual speculative development towards Whitehead's opus magnum. But if we make a leap from 1925 to 1929, it is obvious that his 1925 speculation was reaffirmed in Process and Reality. In Process and Reality, elementary events are called actual entities, but they are still processes of prehensive unification. Process and Reality's definition of the psyche of a human being is in accord with the definition of the electron. It is the historical route of actual entities that are dominant in the living body at successive moments. But this also implies that each moment in our psychological stream of experience is a process of prehensive unification of the actual entities in our past. Our past mental, neural, bodily, and outside world actual entities all belong to our actual world, and they are all prehended by our present moment of mental experience. It would be wrong, however, to think that all our prehensions are conscious and cognitive. And even the integral feeling to which the process of integration of prehensions amounts to is not necessarily conscious and cognitive, but if it is called by Whitehead an intellectual feeling. The question remains how past actual entities can be prehended by a present actual entity. Now, in electrodynamics, the prehension of past electric events is the prehension of the wave potentials due to the electric charges that characterize these past events. Well, in Whitehead's process philosophy, the physical prehension of past actual entities implies the conceptual prehensions of eternal objects. A conceptual prehension is not a simple transfer of a quality that characterizes a past actual entity to the present actual entity. No, each conceptual prehension is an ingression of a potential from the past. And it is these potentials that Whitehead called pure potentials or eternal objects. What I just said about process and reality, I think, shows that Whitehead's 1925 imaginative generalization of the electrodynamic concept of prehension still holds in 1922. It also makes clear, I hope, that the notion of prehension is indeed a key notion of Whitehead's process philosophy, giving rise to its ontology of actual entities and eternal objects. And if you are not yet fully convinced by what I said, here is how Whitehead looked back on process and reality at the occasion of his 70th birthday. The notion of the prehension of the past means that the past is an element which perishes, but thereby remains an element in the state beyond and is thus objectified. That is the whole notion. If you get a general notion of what is meant by perishing, you will have accomplished an apprehension of what you mean by memory and causality, what you mean when you feel that what we are is of infinite importance, because as we perish, we are immortal. That is the one key around which the whole development of process and reality is woven. 3. Application to the AI debate. I first introduced the notion of subjective form of apprehension. This notion is not a generalization from mathematics or electrodynamics, but a crucial addition if we want to apply process philosophy to the issue of human versus artificial intelligence. In Process and Reality, Whitehead distinguishes between what is prehended and how it is prehended, between what he calls the objective data and the subjective form of prehensions. We can best understand the notion of subjective form by looking at some of our own feelings. When we feel that a joke is enjoyable, a meal disgusting, a murder horrible, a mathematical pattern important, or a name valuable, we do not only feel the objective joke, meal, murder, mathematical pattern, or aim, but also the subjective joy, disgust, horror, importance, or value. They are the subjective forms of our feelings. Now, Whitehead did not only attribute subjective forms to our fully fledged feelings, but also to all prehensions in the prehensive unification giving rise to those feelings. The reason for my introduction of the notion of subjective form is that each prehensive unification is guided by the subjective forms of all prehensions involved, and in particular by the subjective forms of our unconscious conceptual prehensions. According to Whitehead, these conceptual prehensions have the subjective form of valuation because they all share in the ultimate creative aim of each prehensive unification to achieve some maximum depth of intensity of feeling. The valuation can be a valuation up or a valuation down. In the former case, the intensity of importance of the pure potentials that the conceptual prehensions feel are increased. In the latter case, decreased. As a result of these valuations, the subjective forms of the feelings to which subjective forms of the feelings to which the prehensive unifications amount are characterized by an integral pattern of intensity of importance. And that's how an actual entity constitute what that actual entity is. This subjective pattern of intensity of importance fits the objective pattern of the resulting feelings, which include our intellectual feelings. A mathematician cannot have an intuitive judgment of recognition of a pattern in the objective data if the subjective form of this judgment is not characterized by a corresponding pattern of intensity of importance. Likewise, a natural scientist cannot have a conscious perception of an object if the subjective form of this perception is not characterized by a corresponding pattern of intensity of importance. Again, in the absence of subjective patterns of intensity of importance, none of us would be able to recognize winning moves in a chess game, or a particular plant or animal, or a particular bird song, and so on. But wait a moment. In the last decade, artificial intelligence companies have created AI software that seems to equal or surpass our human recognition skills. They created AlphaZero, which can beat the best chess, Go, and shogi players. They created apps such as Opsidentify or Merlin Bird ID, which we can install on our smartphones and which can recognize plants and animals in a picture, or bird species from a particular sound we recorded, and so on and so forth. So, has AI equaled or surpassed human intelligence? I don't think so. And I will briefly hint at some reasons for this claim by applying Whitehead's process philosophy to the issue. The key idea that led to present-day AI software is the idea that intelligence involves activation patterns in biological and artificial networks. Hence, AI researchers created learning algorithms by means of which the connections between the nodes of an artificial neural network can acquire the appropriate weights. Appropriate means, first, that a given situation, for example, a picture of a bird, is appropriately translated into numbers, for example, pixel intensities, in the nodes of the input layer of the network. Second, that the input numbers are appropriately changed by the learned weights of the connections as the numbers travel via these connections from node to node and from layer to layer through the network. And third, that they arrive at the nodes of the output layer as numbers that form a pattern, which, when translated into language, proves to be an appropriate recognition of what is important in the given situation. For example, that there is an eagle in the picture. From a Whiteheadian point of view, we might say that the success of artificial intelligence is due to a certain similarity of AI's pattern of connection weights with Whitehead's pattern of intensity of importance. So there is this similarity. However, there are a lot of differences that prevent me from concluding that artificial and human intelligence are alike. According to Whitehead, the pattern of intensity of importance is not merely a quantitative pattern. It is at the same time a qualitative pattern. The valuations at play in our prehensive unifications are not merely numerical valuations. They are at the same time qualitative, aesthetic, moral, and religious. This value dimension is absent in AI. Also, in Whitehead's model of intelligence, the transfer of subjective form from the feeling of one situation to another accounts for our ability to form analogies across very different domains of thought, to transfer knowledge from one area to another, to use an old skill to acquire a new one. Each AI software, however, is dedicated to a single task, to a single skill. AlphaZero has indeed learned to play chess, Go, and shogi, but involves different neural networks, each trained from scratch for its particular game. And AI research on transfer learning, that's how they call it, is far from producing meaningful analogies. Also, in Whitehead's model of intelligence, our prehensions of the actual world involves our prehensions of mental, neural, bodily, and outside world actual entities, implying our emotional, embodied, and active intelligence to inhabit an open-ended fluid world of activity. AI, however, largely lacks these components of human intelligence and tends to reduce the actual world to an abstract world of determinate states, objects, properties, and events, like the positions, pieces, and moves in a game. Also, Whitehead holds that the emergence of consciousness in high-level experience, its ingression in the subjective form of a complex feeling, is due to a contrast between what the felt given is and what it is not, but might be. AI gurus simply hold that consciousness will emerge in AI systems as their complexity increases. They fail to give more specific conditions for this emergence to happen, and their claim seems to be no more than an act of fate that at some point a miracle will happen. And finally, as John Cobb has stressed for half a century, Whitehead's philosophy of prehensive relatedness inspires an ecological worldview, whereas AI enthusiasts sell AI as pure intelligence, forgetting its fundamental dependence on physical nature and human society. AI is an extractive industry, one that depends on exploiting energy and mineral resources from the planet, cheap labor, and large-scale social media databases, which capture human bias as well as human knowledge. I conclude with an appeal to explore much more in detail than I could do in this lecture the differences between Whitehead's take on human intelligence and AI. This can help us not to shift our mental activity in the direction of artificial intelligence. We should not mimic artificial intelligence, but strengthen rather than weaken our commitment to genuine human intelligence. Thanks a lot.